Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Good Talk, New Lines Magazine's first Instagram Live series of conversations. Let me just invite our guest who is joining us from California, Dr. Ahmet Kuru. He will be, just a second, he's waiting here for, yes, Dr. Kuru. Okay. So my name is Riada Akyol, and I'm Strategic Initiatives Editor. This is very exciting. Thanks for joining us on this new adventure. Here is Dr. Kuru. He's here from San Diego, California. Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Of course, this is so exciting, and I will introduce you just to say something to, we will put this on YouTube afterwards, so that is the reason why I will now just turn off this beautiful waves and hearts so that it's not distracting in the video that we will post afterwards. You can post questions that we hopefully, and request to go offline, that we will get to at the end of the conversations. But I want to introduce our today's guest. Ahmet Kuru is the director of the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies and professor of political science at San Diego State University. Also commentator, author of several books, including Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment, which we shall talk about today. And I just do want to mention that that book became the co-winner of the American Political Science Association's International History and Politics Section Book Award and received honorable mention of SSSR's Book Award. But just to clarify, SSSR here means Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. And it has been translated into Arabic, Bosnian, Chinese, French, Indonesian, Malay, Persian, and Turkish. Thank you again for joining us from San Diego. It is early for you right now. How are you today?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you to discuss very important matters.
Of course. So let's dive into the conversation, Dr. Kuru. You've been studying Middle Eastern politics and more broadly Muslim politics for over 20 years. Tell us then, according to your research and book, why do Muslim majority countries exhibit these high levels of authoritarianism and low levels of socioeconomic development in comparison to world averages?
Thanks for the question. Let me tell you the background of even reaching the question for myself, because as a Muslim grew up in Turkey, I had a more defensive attitude for a long time, and always trying to show Islam and democracy compatible, which is true. And I still defend my early publications. But in this book, I reach a point that we have to very seriously debate authoritarianism problem by acknowledging it, which made many Muslim authors within my family too very much disappointed. They say, how come you put Islam, authoritarianism, underdevelopment together? My response is that I am not putting that. That's what 50 Muslim majority countries are doing. And as a social scientist, I am observing the fact. And this short response to your complex question is that generally people either blame Islam or Western colonialism. I take both arguments seriously, but criticize them. And instead, I argue that these problems are human-made problems. Mm-hmm. And among the humans, we have to look at the relations between religious group class, political class, scholarly intellectual class, and economic class. When we see religious and political classes, I call ulema state alliance in the Muslim world, or the clergy state alliance in general, that's the main problem from history to present.
And you do acknowledge in many of your writings that there are, of course, multiple causes of authoritarianism and underdevelopment. So you do admit that there are different dimensions, like you're right, ideological and institutional and economic dimensions. And we will try to maybe deconstruct that alliance today a little bit. Okay, so to repeat, if I get it right, you criticize both those who blame Islam as the cause of this disparity, because you say in your book that between 9th and 11th century, Muslims were philosophically more advanced than Western Europeans. But then you also criticize those majority Muslims, if I'm not wrong, who blame only Western colonialism. So you did mention that even members of your family kind of were disappointed with that. Is it tough to say that in academic circles as well?
Yes. So I wish we had hours to discuss because you mentioned three important things. First of all, yes, there are many ideological, institutional, financial aspects of the problem. Therefore, the clergy-state alliance or ulema-state alliance is a multifaceted phenomenon which has economic dimensions. For example, today, this alliance is funded by oil money and historically more feudal agriculture revenue distribution system, ICTA or Timar system. Ideologically, it's based on either Sunni or Shia or other religious orthodoxies. And institutionally, it had thousands of madrasas and other resources. So, a single concept with multiple faces. Second, as you mentioned, that people are upset. For example, some conservative Muslims responded me saying that after Islam, you cannot put comma. After Islam, there's only period. Islam, period. So I understand their point of view, especially, interestingly, among Western Muslims, there is a defensive or apologetic position. Therefore, my book has been well received in subcontinent, Middle East, North Africa, where Muslims live in Muslim majority societies and they see the problems of Islamist politics. Whereas in North America, Western Europe, etc., there are Muslim minorities who don't want to engage with the debate, and rightly so, I understand, because in the US today, we have this Black Lives Matter movement and against discrimination. And they're asking me, why are you bringing these criticisms? So that's why in the Muslim majority societies where people are aware of the problems, it is much better received. And the last point to answer your third point, which is that it is on the one hand nothing to do with Islam, but at the same time, ulema state alliance based on certain interpretations of Islam. Jihadi Salafism is associated with violence. Sunni and Shia orthodoxies, when they promote blasphemy and apostasy laws, they produce the problem. Similarly, colonialism, colonization, of course, they are part of the problem. But at the core, we see this clergy-state alliance.
That's really interesting. You brought also so many things that we could talk about, but just to also get back to kind of chronologically a little bit to make it understandable. So you say, for example, that we have period between 8th and 11th century, and then after the mid 11th century, I think, is when you say things go downwards in the Muslim world, where Western Europeans and Western Europe experienced, as you write, the institutionalization of church and state separation, many other factors that came into place, which made that development over there much more dynamic. But so you say it was mid 11th century, kind of, that is a milestone for this alliance between Orthodox Islamic scholars and military state to emerge. So what ensued afterwards? What was the consequence of this, and what are we then seeing over the next few centuries while this ulema state alliance was spreading?
Again, a $1 million question.
Exactly.
Yeah, let me very briefly.
Teaser. Yeah, this is a teaser for everybody to then afterwards read a book. Of course, I know, but that's how when I was reading, got chronological phases.
Of course.
Several milestones, right?
Yes. So the debate, again, to make it simplistic a little bit, there are some who says that there was no Muslim golden age. It was all about Greek and Sasani sciences. Muslims didn't bring something new. That's one polar argument. The opposite is that it's all about Islam. We were good Muslims and successful, then stop being good Muslim, whatever it is, then decline. I criticize both, saying that, look, between 8th to mid-11th century, Muslims not only learned from Greek and Sasanian, but they brought new issues like optics in Ibn Haytham, medical sciences, Razi, Ibn Sina, and others, mathematics, learning from India and others, but also making original contributions. That's one thing. But on the other hand, my book also tried to explain that it was not all about Islam. Islam was one part of it. The success of Muslims was ability to bring together multiple cultures and civilizations and produce a multi-ethnic, multi-religious civilizational success. So that's historical debate.
Yeah.
And this debate also rejects the notion that Christianity is always appreciating church-state separation, whereas Islam always reject. I said, no, look, until the mid-11th century, the German Holy Roman emperors were appointing many bishops, sometimes popes, no institutionalized church-state separation. That's why it's called Gregorian reforms or 11th century reforms. So before 11th century, Europe looked like Middle East today. Of course, I'm caricaturizing.
Of course,
but clergy-state alliance, marginalized intellectuals almost didn't exist, and the merchants. Whereas the Muslim world looked like post-Renaissance Europe, with strong bourgeoisie, strong intellectual class. And in the 11th century, in the Muslim world, there happened an economic crisis, which led to more feudal economic system, a Sunni-Shia tension and competition, which led to orthodoxy emerging both Sunni and Shia world. Then the ulema, who refused to serve the state for financial and ideological reasons, tried to establish a partnership, which was institutionalized by Nizamiya madrasas of the Seljuk Empire. Whereas in Europe, in the 11th century, clergy-state separation plus universities plus a new merchant class emerged in Italy and elsewhere that caused what we call the rise of the West.
Yeah. And then in 15th and 16th centuries, as you say, that alliance spread. And on top of that, then in the 18th century, we got the colonialism, the widespread European colonization of the Muslim lands, which of course made everything much worse. But importantly, again, what you're saying is that before the colonization, these problems were already in place. And that is an important point that you emphasize in the book. And so then, even the reforms, so to speak, that happened afterwards in 19th century failed. This time it was, you write that these reformers, so to speak, were too state-centric. So what did they do or what they didn't do? Why did that whole thing fail?
Two important points. One is the Mongols and Crusaders, two Western colonizers, the foreigners. I'm saying that, look, foreign invasions from the Mongols to British-French imperialism are important, but they mostly re-empower ulema state alliance, because when Muslims face survival threats, military occupation, they turn their face to military heroes like Salahuddin, Mamluks, the Ottomans, and the clergy and Sufi sheikhs and religious preaching. And that's the decline of philosophy and sciences and economic entrepreneurs in the Muslim world. That's the destruction of foreigners. Then Muslims recover by establishing very powerful empires, Ottoman, Safavi, Mughal. And even today with TV series from Turkey to Pakistan, they glorify this past. But that military heroism didn't bring the old Muslim scientific philosophical achievements. Muslims didn't get the printing press. Muslims didn't catch up with Western geographical discoveries and everything. That's the problem. Fast forwarding to Tanzimat era, 19th century Ottoman, 20th century secularism, all the way to say Atatürk's secular republic. Crucial question. If the ulema is the problem, look, many secularists from Turkey's Kemal to Egypt's Cemal, Abdel Nasser, Habibpur gibi Baas Party and elsewhere, they sideline ulema, but still problems were not solved. My answer is that yes, they did, but they were too much state-centric, military trained. They marginalized intellectuals and the bourgeoisie because their notion of economy state-centric, even culture and ideological life state-centric, mostly influenced by European authoritarian ideologies of 1920s, 30s, 40s. That's the problem even today. From Turkey elsewhere, secularists and Islamists look like each other. They are both anti-bourgeoisie, anti-intellectual to a very large degree.
That's really sad and fascinating at the same time to keep seeing all these different dynamics that keep producing the same outcome that's so different than the golden age that we had. So what did the failures then of these secularist leaders lead to in Muslim majority countries? Because in the past 4 decades, most Muslim majority countries have experienced a new wave now of social and political Islamization. So what did that result in? How did that, in your opinion, impact the situation on the ground?
So from the Turkish Republic 1923 to the Iranian Revolution 1979, there was, as we talk, a secularist trend. Mm-hmm. But that secularist trend couldn't revibrate and lead a renaissance of economy and intellectual life, create a disappointment. Islamists took advantage of it, make propaganda, make their arguments popular, blaming secularist failures. Plus, Iran and Saudi Arabia use oil money for their global spread of Salafist and Islamist ideas. And it's also circular. In the United States, too, we see a circle of secular and religious movements. Action create reaction. As a result, in the last 40 years, in the Muslim world, we see Islamist backlash with the secularist failures, with oil money, with Islamist propaganda, supported by ulema and Sufi sheikhs. And the result is Islamization at the political and socio-legal spheres. That's why when we look at the 50 Muslim countries today, we see 22 of them have secular constitutions. Mm-hmm. That's the legacy of early secularist trends. Mm-hmm. About 18 with Sharia-based constitutions, that's the result of Islamist trend, and the 10 mix, but nowhere we see stable liberal democracies except Southeast Asia and West Africa. And the Balkans.
I was going to ask, what about the Balkans? That's good. So what do you argue then, Dr. Kuru? I mean, what would Muslim majority countries have to do on their part, that is, because obviously nothing happens in a vacuum to stop these authoritarian trends, to get into the development track. You write or speak often about 4 recommendations. I wish it was only 4, but what are they, and what do you think? What are your advices for the policymakers or those who are working for change?
This is important because I didn't write the book in a pessimistic perspective. Instead, I am very optimistic. And I try to find some solutions or be part of the solution. So the recommendations, first of all, acknowledge the problem, don't deny it. Then do not blame either Islam or Western colonialism solely. Look at the ulema state allies. Then be aware of that Islam does not reject a reform. Islam had a history of separation of religion and state. Between 8th and 12th century, out of 4,000 ulema, only 10% served the state as qadis, etc. 90% had private funding. Abu Hanifa and others reject to serve the state, despite threats. Today, that's the opposite in Turkey and elsewhere. Almost 90% of ulema are state servant. That's the problem, need to be addressed. Then economically, Muslim societies need competitive, meritocratic system of economic entrepreneurs rather than the rentier model based on oil and natural gas money or selling lands as rent. So these are the solutions possibly be promoted. But this ulema state model is very persistent because they taught as a religious commandment. In fact, neither Quran nor Hadith doesn't say anything about this alliance. But since 11th century, the propaganda is very deep. They fabricated a Hadith saying that religion and state are twins. And they reinterpret an important phrase in the Quran, ulul emri minkum, as if it commands people to obey ulama and state. So against this propaganda, we need more books like Mustafa Akyol's books or my book and others to really show different interpretations are possible.
That's really interesting that you say, because I was thinking while reading your book, and you write that since the consensus of the ulema is emphasized as one of the four sources of Islamic knowledge, it's very difficult to challenge that monopoly of in interpretation. So it seems sometimes almost impossible, but only when I'm in my pessimist mood to think about the challenges to that, because something is presented as a sacred commandment, of course. And primarily I'm referring to the states that have countries with Sharia-based constitution, but you kindly and rightly pointed out, like you're right, that there is a diversity among constitutions as well. Other countries have secular or mixed constitutions, and different Muslim countries have a variation in terms of the economic systems. And so you did say, but just to confirm, did you find something interesting based on your research about countries with a lower degree of ulema-state alliance and a lower degree of rentierism in terms of these outcomes, I guess?
Yes, I did. And this is a very, very important point because it shows that Muslim world is not a monolithic. There are diverse regimes in Southeast Asia. Indonesia is a democracy and with largest Muslim population. And I had the chance to analyze two major Islamic groups there, Nahdlatul Ulema with over 80, 90 million followers, and Muhammadiyah with 30 million followers. And they both support democracy, and they both reject the idea of Sharia-based state or the idea of caliphate. This is an interesting case in Southeast Asia. Malaysia was economically growing, though politically now it is no longer defined as a democracy. In West Africa, Senegal is an important case of what I call passive secularism, democracy, Sufi toleration. Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso were also following the mood, although they recently faced multiple crises. And in the Balkans, as you know better than me, in Bosnia, Albania, Kosovo, we have more democratic and open systems going on or in working condition. So what makes these three corners different? First of all, they don't have deep ulema state alliance in the Middle East, North African, Central Asian historically sense. In Indonesia, for example, there is no Diyanet, there is no LSR type unifying institution. The two major groups I mentioned have their own systems independent of the state. In Senegal, Sufis have more eclectic and decentralized system. And in the Balkans, too, it is not as strict as the Middle East, ulema state alliance. So therefore, the low degree makes democracy and development more possible. Plus, we don't see oil rentierism, neither in the Balkans, nor West Africa, nor Southeast Asia, except Malaysia, which is problematic. Indonesia was an oil producer, no longer. Now it is oil importer, which is a good thing because oil hinders democracy in many cases.
Wow, what a diversity we like to think about all these different countries and the situation there. So you did say that you didn't write or finish this book as a pessimist. I was going to ask you, are you an optimist or a pessimist? Do you see an impetus that is? Do you see some sort of galvanization for these changes that you argue for, based either on the reactions or the demand that you mentioned in terms of reception of your book at the beginning? And so, and that leads me, I guess, I want to hear your comments also about the situation in Afghanistan right now. I must add that we at New Lines Magazine have a truly amazing coverage of Afghanistan. I encourage everyone to really check it out. Just yesterday, I think Fazil Minallah Kazizai wrote about Taliban's new decree calling for women to cover their faces in public as the quote, latest sign that the Taliban government is increasingly out of touch with the mood of the nation. And then recently we had Ahmed Walid Kakar, who wrote in detail about the so-called Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice, about the ultra-conservative policies and internal dissent within Taliban and all sorts of amazing dynamics that everyone who follows Afghanistan should know about. But that also in terms of what you see as the kind of reaction or impetus for the changes that you advocate, my question was then, what will happen if these changes that you argue for that are necessary don't come to life? What?
We'll keep trying. So when we look at the world historical perspective, achievements like Muslim golden age between 8th to 11th century and Europe's recent centuries are very rare. They are precious. Open societies, diversity, productivity, creativity, toleration, that's rare achievement of human beings. Therefore, we should hold them dearly. As you see in the United States, we could have lost it during the Trump administration and the transition. So many crises happening even in the US. And that's why we should not be pessimistic about the Muslim world, because it is very difficult to achieve these things. And Muslims showed the world how it was possible for 3, 4, 5 centuries on many levels, which makes me optimistic about a renaissance, which also gives an inspiration to Muslim young people, youth, and the next generation. And what I am and others like myself trying to promote is not simply Western agenda. There is really no consistent Western agenda to promote democracy in the Middle East. I wish there was, but there is not. The Muslim societies, by being inspired their own history, can, in the future, create more open societies with toleration and diversity. Let me give you an example. In the 9th century, when Muslims established the world's biggest hospital in Baghdad, chief medical doctors were Christian and Jews. Then 4 centuries later, in Egypt, they established Mansour Hospital, which is also world renowned, but this time they say a non-Muslim cannot practice medical science. So that's the decline I'm talking about. And it's continued because the Christian population is shrinking in the Middle East. That wasn't the case when Muslims were successful. Diversity brings enrichment and more creativity. That's what we need in the future again.
And very importantly, that's thank you for mentioning that you do write in your book that secularism is not sufficient for democratization. And it was very interesting for me to learn how you write about assertively secular state versus, was it passive secularism, if I recall well from your work. I think that is always important to kind of clear to the listeners and to the viewers. But I'm gonna just tease a little bit more, not to play devil's advocate, but just really to ask you. We speak here about democracy, right? But what happens if one leader's understanding of democracy only translates into elections? What happens about those minorities, so to speak, that, as you say, in certain part like Middle East are shrinking? What about human rights for them?
Of course, election itself is necessary but insufficient. We need the protection of rights and liberties by judicial system and other checks and balances and balance of power. Otherwise, you have majority tyranny or one-man rule or one-party rule. And in many Islamization brought, unfortunately, this type of pseudo-democracies or authoritarian regime. And I'm worried that it will bring a strong secularist backlash in Turkey, Iran, and some other parts of the Muslim world. Public surveys show that young generation is not only now living Islam as a religion, but also being more politically against anything Islamic. But as you mentioned in my previous book, I talk about passive religious friendly secularism, and I still defend it as a middle point between assertive Islamism and assertive secularism. I hope in Iran, Turkey, and elsewhere, after assertive Islamism, we will not see assertive secularism. Democracy, pluralism, liberalism, and passive secularism can be the middle ground between these two extreme polar opposites.
Yeah, thank you for that. And of course, we could then open a whole different conversation about Western Europe and what secularisms in France, for example, or UK, or even here in the United States translate to, particularly France, when we speak about Muslim minority there. I want to be respectful of your time. I was going to ask you one more question before we wrap it up, if we have time. I saw in an interview for 5 Books you spoke about why you're critical of the notion of the caliphate. Do we have time to briefly tell to our listeners and viewers, why are you critical of that notion before we wrap?
Always, yeah. I am critical of the glorification and presenting the idea as if God commands us to do, and putting all other important things aside. It is, my understanding, a historical construction. If Muslims today want a union like European Union, this is fine. I'm not going to criticize it. But as a utopia, messianism, pursuing a Mahdi, pursuing a caliph, and giving a man authority as a caliph, that's what Mawardi and others wrote in their books, without term limit, without any checks and balances, without balance of power. These are very dangerous ideas, because the caliphate you pursue basically means a one-man rule dictatorship. These are my criticisms of too much religious emphasis and without modern understanding of democratic polity. If Muslims somehow reach a level of cooperation, that will be fine. But look at China and Uyghur problem. We don't see cooperation among Muslims, even in a tragedy like the violation of Muslims' rights in China or elsewhere. That's why discussing caliphate is at this point doesn't seem very reasonable.
Well, thank you for this brief 30 minutes long overview of a great history. Is there anything that you would like to add to the end? You said that, I was going to ask you, what are you working on right now? And you said you will keep on trying to keep promoting these ideas. Are you working on a new book? Can you tell us something? Or what's going on right now in your scholarly, prolific research?
Thank you. In fact, I am starting to write a new book this summer with the title, We All Need Secular State, Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Jews, and Atheists. And the idea is that I'm going to write a defense of the secular state. We need not only in Muslim societies, but also in Israel, we need a secular state that protect the rights of Muslims and non-Jews. We need a secular state in India to protect the rights of Muslims and non-Hindus. We need a secular state in China to protect the rights of all religious groups, not only the atheists. And we need a secular state here in the United States, which the Supreme Court, if the Supreme Court is not going to protect, we should protect it here in the United States.
Sounds like you're going to be very busy. I look forward to being connected and keep following your work. Thank you so much for joining us at the first episode of Good Talk. I hope to share this soon with the wider audiences, and have a nice day.
Thank you, Riyad Akyol, and to New Lines Magazine. Have a nice day to you too.
Bye to California, and thank you all of you who have watched us. Stay tuned for next Wednesday and a new conversation, new Good Talk. Have a good day. Bye.